Welcome to Cold War Conversations, the home of real stories of the Cold War.
I said to my platoon sergeant, I said, "What's that smell?" And he said, "I've smelt it before, so that's burning people." Boom, say it smells like bacon. It's quite horrific to say it, but that's what it was. And it stuck in my head for the rest of my life. If I'm anywhere near a sort of barbecue thing, pork chops or something, that immediately, that's my PTSD. That's the thing that comes back all the time.
This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to first-hand Cold War history accounts. Do make sure you follow us in your podcast app so that you don't miss out on future episodes. Author and Parachute Regiment veteran David Mackay returns to share his compelling journey through military service. From his humble beginnings in Scotland to his experiences in the Parachute Regiment, David recounts tales of courage, leadership and the harsh realities of conflict. Hear about his time in Northern Ireland, the challenges and adventures in Cyprus, and service in Cold War Berlin. Discover how these experiences shaped his perspective on life, leadership and the world. I'm delighted to welcome David Mackay back to our Cold War conversation.
I come from a working class background. I lived on what in England would be called a housing estate. In Scotland we call them schemes. So I lived on a scheme. It was full of people trying to escape and get on with life, aspirational parents, all that stuff. Our parents had been all through the war, etc. And we all wanted to do great things. So I ended up paying sufficient amount of attention at school. I was a full-time scout. I was always go to the scouts before doing any schoolwork. But I got enough qualifications and I went off to university, the University of Glasgow. I could say I studied there, but I didn't really. I went through the motions, etc., etc. And when it came to graduation, I had been doing a course in, don't laugh, educational psychology. But I was going to be a teacher because that was a great step forward, from the working class and do something like that. And I decided after having a certain amount of teaching experience, I couldn't face it. It was all these dead people in a staff room, and I was an outdoor person. So I joined the Territorial Army, and that in itself has a bit of an odd story to it. My dad had been invalided out of the Second World War. He was a merchant seaman. He'd been sunk 3 times. And apparently those days, that was enough to get you excused from going back. So he spent the last year of the war back in Glasgow. He worked at the docks, at York Hill Docks. And that's where the big transport museum is in Glasgow now. It's one of the tourist attractions. I told him I was thinking of joining the army and was going to join as an officer because officers were getting paid, second lieutenant was getting paid twice as much as a year one teacher. So that was as good a reason as any. And I knew my uncle had been in the parachute forces during the war, but I never spoke to him about it. And he lived a long distance away. So my dad said that he knew a couple of fellows in the local pub outside the dock who was something, now remember what I'm going to say, something to do with the army. Because there was an old red building there called, I don't know what it was called in those days, and I won't give away the secret before I get to the punchline. But he said, I think that's where they meet. So I phoned in and asked various questions, and I was told to come in to meet the commanding officer. So I went into this building, up the stairs, etc. Victorian building, almost pre-Victorian, in fact, because it had a monument to the Boer War in it. And this shambolic-looking gentleman with a wrinkly suit came out. And I said, I'm looking for the commanding officer, and said, "Oh, come on up. I'll take you round to the office. So he took me along to this office, which said, Commanding Officer, Lieutenant Colonel J.G. Starling, MBE, MC, on it. And he went in and he sat down behind the desk. And this was the great Joe Starling. And he listened to me and he said, right, you come in, join the TA, and we'll put you through initial training in here. And you can apply and go to the officer selection board. And this will be good for you. Because I knew nothing about the army, nothing at all. So I then asked him, I said, my dad knows these two fellows, and one's called Alistair and one's called Lackey. I said, oh yeah, Lackey. Lackey he was the commanding officer before me, but he's a teacher at Glasgow Academy. And I went, gee whiz. He was a wartime paratrooper. And the other one is Alistair Pearson, who was the greatest soldier in World War II. He got recommended for VC 4 times and got 4 DSOs, etc. So he's the great idol, the icon of airborne forces. So that was me. I then went off, to various weekends and got my body beasted, etc. But just plodded along and ended up at the officer selection board down in deepest Wiltshire. I went through that very easy because being a scout leader as I was, everything you do is the type of things you give scouts to do, initiative tasks, get over that gap and climb up this tree and build the bridge or whatever. So that was it. And 6 weeks later, I turned up at Mons Officer Training School in Aldershot. And 6 months later, I was commissioned into the Parachute Regiment. We immediately left and went on to P Company, which was a bit of a shock. So I went through the P Company, came out of that, did parachuting, just got on with it. That was the job. You can't do anything. The only wild thing that happened was during the P Company, you have to go to the swimming pool and swing about on a big trapeze and then let go and plunge into the water. So I did all of that and got to the side. And one of the P Company staff leaned over and grabbed me. He said, you can't swim. I said, I know I can't. I said, I can walk along the bottom. They said, yeah, I've been watching you. So I went through my entire army career unable to swim. That was just utter stupidity. But I had confidence that I could float or walk along the bottom. I eventually learned to swim after my oldest son had a badge for swimming 1,000 meters. I thought it was about time for me to get going. So that was me. Immediately, within 2 weeks of finishing the parachute course, I went to 3 para, and within 4 weeks, we were out in Northern Ireland. So that was it. So there I was, a keen young guy. I had travelled a bit with the Scouts, going to summer camps, mainly in England. So it wasn't those that I'd grown up exclusively in Glasgow, Scotland. And wow, what an adventure it was. It was just, in the end, it makes impositions on your life. But as an adventure, you can't beat it. And that's what every old soldier will tell you, comes out and it's a bit dull. Whatever your very exciting job in Civvy Street is, it's a bit dull, And that's how we are. I may never grow up. So there I was with 3 para. We went, first of all, to Fermanagh, to Enniskillen. It was very interesting because we took over from another unit who were either going away or going up to Belfast or whatever. And we were there for 6 weeks. And the first thing I jibbed at was I got a briefing from the ops officer about a patrol that I had to take. We had to do it every night. It was to the BBC station on Bruffer Mountain. Brougher Mountain. So I went out and had a look at this place, and I thought, wait a minute, there's only one way into this, and all this track that goes up this big hill. So it's dead easy for an ambush. I went back and told the captain that we weren't going to do it that way. He said, you'll do it, blah, blah, blah. And my platoon sergeant pulled me aside and said, sir, shut up. We'll sort it out. So from then on, I made sure that my patrols did not go up the path. They went up from the side of the mountain or from the village on the other side, all this type of stuff. So you couldn't be predicted. Then one morning, 2 weeks in, we got a call, 8 o'clock in the morning, round about then, boom, there's been an explosion, Bruffer Mountain, and out we whistled, and there we found it. The BBC guys had gone up in the Land Rover, boom, 5 of them blown to pieces. So that was, welcome to Northern Ireland. Within 3 weeks, we're picking up the bodies and clearing the path around. After that, we went to Belfast, which was even more fun. And we had a funny there. It wasn't a funny, it's just a funny name in the end. Because someone else called John Travolta got famous on this name. When we were in Belfast, it was the early days of football programmes on the telly. And on a Sunday afternoon throughout the UK, the BBC would have the football programme, whatever it was called, I can't remember it. So we would have Friday night and Saturday night mayhem. But when it came to 3 o'clock or 2 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon, everything went quiet because all the bad lads were all in watching the football on the telly. And so therefore we used to call Saturday Night Fever. That was it. And I was puzzled years later. I said, how did John Travolta get that name? But one of the interesting points about being in Northern Ireland was years later I found out from one of the other officers who left at the end of his short service commission and joined he joined the Foreign Office as a diplomat. Right. So you obviously know what he did in the Foreign Office. He said the spy trawlers, which the Russians were using up and down the west coast of Scotland to track the nuclear subs, they were also listening in to all our conversations in Northern Ireland. And I thought, we didn't know. We only knew there was some sort of a Cold War intervention in it. We had various rumours through the intelligence that Russian or Czech weapons were making their way into the hands of the IRA or Provos or whatever. But that was all we knew at the time. So that took me through my first 2 years. Oh, yes. It then became even more interesting in a Cold War point of view. So that was after, went to about June, and we came home in June, and our commanding officer was a true paratrooper. So instead of us flying back to the UK, we parachuted back to the UK. So we managed to avoid getting blown up or shot during that period, but 1 or 2 guys bounced on the DZ. And 3 or 4 weeks after that, we went to Ghana. Ghana had just got through the turmoil of its original minister, Nkrumah, and he'd become very chummy with the Chinese, so the British government wanted us to counter the Chinese effect. So we went there to do 2 things. We went to go up into the northern jungly area and chase out the Chinese who were up there, setting up these training camps for terrorists or whatever you want. And we did that, and it was very interesting because when we would go to a place, recce it, and surround it, and then go in, and you'd find, they departed, but it had a proper camp layout, etc. But one of the other things we were there to do was to prevent a military coup. Our colonel told us about this. 6 weeks after we got back, we were having a mess night in Aldershot, where all the subalterns are all saying, oh God, it wasn't the time to go home. And all the other guys are making their careers by talking to important people. And the adjutant came bowling in with a newspaper and he said to the colonel, bloody hell, sir, look at this. And there it was. I think it was the Times or the Telegraph. It certainly wouldn't have been the Guardian. that was until I became a bit more senior. Then I insisted on the Guardian. But the headline was quite straightforward. The government of Ghana has been overthrown by the military. And it was the military parachute battalions that we were over there training. So our way of preventing the military coup accomplished one. But maybe they were the goodies in our government's view. That's the type of people who wouldn't mind overthrowing the government. So after that, we mucked about.
Can I just hold you there for a moment, because I just want to ask a couple of questions. I mean, what's it like being a newly minted second lieutenant, and then obviously being responsible for troops in a hostile environment? I mean, are you filled with imposter syndrome, or how do you handle that?
This is what I talked about before we started. You think about something you did years ago, and it's influenced by what's happened in the years since. Basically, I was very confident because I'd been a scout leader and I'd operated, every week, 2 or 3 times a week, in charge of younger people and telling them what to do and organising things. So that side was easy. But I remember after sort of the first week or whatever, I was sitting having a cup of tea and thinking to myself, and the platoon sergeant came over, and this chap ended up as the RSM of the battalion. He's the famous guy in the Falklands who's drinking a cup of tea after he captured Fort Stanley. And he said, once I'll go for a walk. He said to me, look, you don't have to worry about telling these guys what to do. They'll do it because you're the boss. You're the boss. I said, don't worry about thinking, well, what right have I to do? You're as well trained as them and you know as much as them. Some of them have been to wars and you haven't. So what? I said, the reason that you're the boss is when the shit hits the fan, somebody has to make a decision. And that decision normally involves putting other people's lives in danger. So you're the guy that makes those decisions and they will get on with obeying them. Now, when he explained that to me, I became all straightforward because I had always felt a bit uncomfortable with people saluting me and whatsoever and calling me sir and banging their feet in when they came to talk to me. And, I think, what the hell is this? I don't need this. Oh, I can do without that. It's all part of the game. You can't do it otherwise. So that was how I dealt with this. And I had no problems with the other officers. The other officers were guys who were my equal, who were senior to me or whatever, but that was just human relationships. It was, how do I relate to the soldiers? And yes, you do learn over the years, but it's the same in any activity you take part in where you're in charge of others. You learn better how to handle things. Initially, I suppose we're a wee bit too much by the book, because that's the only knowledge we have. But then we begin to relax and listen to people and let them tell us what they think and then guide them into the path. But that was how it was. It didn't really cause me a problem. I thought, right, I've got to make sure that I make the right decisions. Boom. And the soldiers are quite happy to salute me.
That's really interesting insight into sort of the responsibilities of command and how it works. You mentioned this Land Rover that was blown up on the mountain. I mean, you were clearing up the remnants of that explosion. And, you mentioned working with the scouts and things like that. So this was something completely different to what you dealt with before. This was the first time you actually seen the human toll of conflict.
Hey, when we got to the scene, there were some police vehicles had come in and a helicopter had come in. It was one of the little MASH type of helicopters, a little scout helicopter, a little glass bubble, and that was bringing in the bomb disposal officer. And in those days, you just walked about with a stick. You didn't have any protective clothing. But when we got out and we debussed from our 4-tonner and jumped out and boom, boom, lads formed up and I said to my platoon sergeant, I said, "What's that smell?" And he said, "I've smelt it before, so that's burning people, boom." So it smells like bacon. It's quite horrific to say it, but that's what it was. And it stuck in my head for the rest of my life. If I'm anywhere near a sort of barbecue thing and they're doing sort of bacon chops or pork chops or something, that immediately, like, that's my PTSD. That's the thing that comes back all the time. Bang, straight away. But then you had to wipe it. That didn't matter. Get your guys there, spread them out, make sure they all keep behind you, because I'm the point man. I'm going along checking for wires from where I can see, etc. And we found a wire later on. The bomb man came up and did something to it, and it was all right. So it was baptism of fire. So I'd been through P Company, I'd been through a parachute course, and there we are, a bomb explosion that had killed 5 guys. So after that, I actually had no problem at all focusing on the important things of soldiering. It's basically that there's lots of nice people, but as soon as they put their feet on the grass, they're a wee bit, I was at home putting my feet in the grass. That's where I wanted to be all the time. And I knew what the consequences were of getting it wrong. It was nothing to do with my career. It was to do with, life and limb of my soldiers and me.
Thanks for that, David. I really appreciate you sharing that with me. So this is 1971 to 1972, and you also have a United Nations tour in Cyprus.
Well, this was me. This is within 18 months of being commissioned. In fact, earlier than that, about 15 months, FA Cup final, 1972. I was still football officer 1 para, so I was entitled to FA Cup final ticket. And I said, "Well, does anybody else want them?" I said, "No." I said, "Well, I could have it." Then I was told I was on the advance party to go to Cyprus, which left the week before the FA Cup final. So I didn't get to the FA Cup final. Off we went. We were basically down in the south. That was before the Greeks and the Turks had the dust up. And we were in mixed villages, and our job was to make sure that the water wasn't being cut off and nobody was stealing the sheep, and above all, the olive trees. Now, so our knowledge of olives was zero. Nowadays, we know all about olives and how valuable they are. And we couldn't understand why that every olive bush would have a young boy sleeping there, and he'd have a dog, and that was the biggest thing. Occasionally, we'd have problems with the water supply, but not very often. But what we found hard was we mainly worked with the Greeks. They were very aggressive towards the Turkish people there because they were in a huge majority. And we'd say, "You have to watch because," here we go, "the Turks have an airborne division," I think it's 42nd Division or whatever, that sits over there on the south coast, 1 hour and 20 minutes flight away from Cyprus, and you've had it if you annoy them. And that's what happened, in 74, the Turks came across. So the first bit was learning about Cyprus, the history, and getting a bit of an insight into these intractable, because all these things are intractable, this Catholic, Protestant, Greeks and Turks in Cyprus, Israelis and Arabs, they are intractable. You cannot make them any better. You can't solve them. You just have to try and manage them so they don't get out of order. So that was, a very good and very enjoyable time in Cyprus. Really enjoyed it. Got to learn. I'm a bit of I'll call myself a geek. I don't know anything about technology. I'm not interested. But foreign languages, I'll go and learn them. So I could speak reasonable Greek and a sort of reasonable Turkish to get me by. And, they were all amazed. Nowadays, I can hardly remember 2 words of it because, I haven't used it forever. So it was a great experience. You were traveling the world. I learned later on how important Cyprus was in terms of the Cold War, but I didn't know that at the time. That was only when I did all the research for my book for Bubbleheads that I learned its importance as basically a spy station, on Troodos Mountain and down at Ias and Nikolaos. Shh, don't tell anyone. But so I learned loads and loads of things by being in the army. I didn't necessarily learn them at the time, but yeah, it was different.
I think you were given warnings about Russian sailors while you were in Cyprus.
Well, this is a funny bit. As I said, we went back. I went back in 1976 after the after that invasion of the Turks onto the island, and the island had split into two halves. But at both times, we were in the south, and there'd be warnings, every week or 2 weeks in the intelligence briefs. Int briefs are a big joke in the army, right? They're just complete. You can feed any baloney into the system, and eventually it'll come out as intelligence. So you would be taught, and this is true. I could even get my old notebook and say that's the one I put in. We would get warnings saying that there's quite a lot of, Russian ships in here because they're trying to, make an impression and, invest, which they have done. Unbelievable nowadays what the Russians have done in Cyprus. But the guys, these aren't sailors. These are all members of the KGB, and they're looking for people to, find out information from. I found all of this was 100% accurate when I did Bubbleheads. We had the spy trawlers and all of that. So we were always giving briefings to the soldiers. When you're out, make sure if you see any Russians, don't say anything that might be useful. And bearing in mind, we were in the United Nations, so we didn't really have any pertinent information. But it was, I suppose, about trying to lure us in with honey traps or whatever, but I don't think that ever came our way. Well, maybe it did. I don't know. I mean, our guys were, airborne warriors. They're crafty. They would take the money and they, sort out the bad guys. But in the main, these were just flags, which I didn't know at the time. None of us knew at the time. These were flags. This is the Cold War you're in. Doesn't matter where you go. All of these places, the Russian influence is trying to counter the Western influence, and they come in. And when I went the second time, yes, I got involved with the Americans at the top of Troodos. That was one of their big signals intelligence posts. I thought it was British, and I thought we could get in for a cup of tea, as we had hiked up the mountain in the dark, about 30 of us. But they said no. I said, well, can you make us some tea and bring it out to the front, please? Which they did, were very helpful. And then we would parachute at Ias Nikolaos. And literally you're lying on the DZ 500 yards away. There are all these the big ears, the ones that we have nowadays, and lots of the masts as well. And being the regimental signals officer, I obviously knew that was that was being used for listening, but I wasn't that interested, But that was it, Everything that you bump into is there for a purpose.
Absolutely. So in 1972, you're promoted.
It meant you get more money. That's what it meant. It didn't make any difference to your status, but you got more money. And you had to put a second pip up. So we always wore our smocks, and Parachute Regiment pips were light blue. So you had one very faded light blue pip and one very bright one. So it was very obvious you'd just been promoted. I suppose some of the more cunning guys would have got them from somebody else who'd been promoted to captain. So he would just look, he's been a lieutenant for a couple of years. But it didn't make any difference what you did. You're still working at regimental level. I went off to the depot to train recruits, which is very interesting, etc. We got one or two activities there. One of them was to go to Denmark on an exchange exercise. And there's a couple of tales on it. The first one is that my commanding officer was an old wartime SAS guy, and he'd been a warrant officer in the SAS, etc. And he won lots of medals. And he was a fabulous soldier, and he was a social horror show. He didn't give a hoot. He came from, I think he came from Staffordshire or someplace like that, but he lived in the Channel Islands. Whether he had liberated them during the war or whatever. But he said, I'm coming out with you on the recce because I want to see a couple of my old SAS pals who were in the Danish squadron or whatever. We got to Heathrow Airport, and I joined the queue, and he was behind me. He said, look, I'm going to have a cup of tea. You get this, you get my briefcase through here. I said, yes, sir. I took his briefcase, and I said, well, I better know what's in it. So I opened it, and sitting in it was a revolver and 50 rounds of ammunition. And this is at the time of the IRA panic, and himself. So I had to go to the people at the counter and explain it to them. And so we eventually got through. I said, this is the Colonel's kit. He needs it, blah, blah, blah. And they were all very understandable. Nowadays, I doubt very much if I would have got the cooperation. They just said, oh, fair enough, no problem, sir. We got to a place called Federicia on Jutland. And it's a very interesting place because its claim to fame was that was the last battle that the Danish army had ever fought. I think it was around, it might have been the Franco-Prussian War, round about then, 1871, round about then. The Prussians went northwards, they passed through Frisia, and they got into Jutland. And they were sorting out the Danes, and the place held for about 5 or 6 weeks. And I think maybe the war stopped, but that was their claim to fame. But when we were there on the exercise, they said, well, we actually have one of these NATO exercises. We have them every 3 months. And we went away with them for 2 days out into the woods to see how they would resist. And their main point in that area was that they would drop trees across the roads. That's all they could do. They couldn't do anything else because they hadn't got a lot of people. But they would go there and they would drop trees. And that was how, they were living very much next door to the Russians. And it was all a bit of a worry. We also went to Elsinore. The Danish sergeant's school for the army was next to the ferry, which went over to Elsinore in Sweden. So we went there. I took my sergeants with me and we went there and we crossed over on the ferry. But when we got to Sweden, we sat down for a cup of tea, and this is a true story because none of us have been to Sweden. So we thought, there we are, 2 guys in the next table. One of my sergeants kept looking at it and he said, so they're speaking Russian. I said, I've heard Russian before. And they were Russians. And everywhere we went in that little town, these guys followed behind us. But the main thing we remembered was the cost of a cup of tea. We're talking about, say maybe it was nowadays. Maybe nowadays it would be £15 or £20 for your cup of tea. And if you wanted a bottle of beer, it would be about £50. It was unbelievable. However, you remember when I told you about the ferry? The ferry was populated by loads of Swedish people going to and fro. And they'd get off at the Danish end. They walk down the gangplank, they buy another ticket, and they walk back. And they could drink and buy all this duty-free alcohol on board the boat. So that's the main thing that my sergeants remembered from that. I was, of course, paying attention to the wider ramifications. But I came out of that. I took another exercise, which was actually just up the road from where I live now at Coolport, Faz Lane, round there. So we parachuted in. We did a bit of mooching about. And we found, going over a hill, it was loads of mist, etc. It was in February of 74. Going over there was very difficult because we came to a big fence and we couldn't go round it, and the fence wasn't on the map. We found out later this was Glen Douglas, the sort of NATO armaments depot where all types of stuff was just over the hill from us. That was how well informed we were in those days. I thought, but these are military maps. These are issued to the army. They have overprints on them, but they still didn't have this thing round the Glen Douglas base. Maybe years later, they did that. So that took me through till I was then approached, would I like to go to Hereford? I said, oh yes, that sounds really exciting, and you get more money for it as well. So I set out to beast my body for a couple of months and did it and blah, blah. Literally 5 days before I was to report to Hereford for the selection, I was running up a very steep hill in Aldershot, and at the top of the hill I met, you recall, the adjutant in 3 Para who came in with the news of the military coup. Well, he was now in 1 Para. And I met him and said, hello, Dougie, how are you? Oh, running on the spot, blah, blah, blah. He said, we're off to Berlin next month, and we'll need someone to be the regimental signals officer. Do you fancy it? And I said, oh, yes, definitely. So that's why I didn't go to Hereford. That was the Airborne Forces HR department in operation. It was done off the top of your head and you got on with it. So I ended up becoming the signals officer, a 3-month course, learning about signals and all of that, communications. And then off we went to Berlin. And Berlin, wow, what a place that was. Absolutely sensational. Pause for breath.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. Did you actually visit the Royal Naval Base in Faslane when you were there?
Yes. We went into the base in Faslane, and they took us down through the levels. They said, we can't get past this one. This is into the sort of controls system, how it's all done. And we worked out that we would be able to break into the base, but we wouldn't really get any further forward than the entrance to the sort of deep underground bit. However, this is an interesting story. Years later, it's the start of 87 maybe, I was given the job of doing what they call TACEVAL. That's called Tactical Evaluation of Military Bases or whatever. And what we basically do, you go around and you attack the RAF and the Navy to see how well, because they are operational bases, not like if you go to Aldershot in those days. Well, they were just bases where we were because we lived there, but we left there to go and, your operational base for the army is actually in the field, whereas the Navy and the RAF, their operational bases are in the UK. They do the same in Germany. So we parachuted in, we did various tricks, we basically cut off the base, stopped the reinforcements getting up from Rosneath, all this type of stuff by doing the tree dropping. You don't actually drop trees, you get spray paint, coloured, and you do it around trees. So you say, well, it's going to take you 4 or 5 hours to clear this way. People wouldn't be able to get up there. They'd have to walk, etc., etc. And we could put 1 or 2 booby traps out. All of that stuff. Because all you were trying for was to get something like a couple of hours delay. Faslane, it was just basically to muck them about as much as possible. Other places, it was to stop the RAF aircraft, like the Phantoms, getting off and using the runway for 2 hours, because that's all the Russian airborne needed to get across and get themselves into the north of Scotland, into Shetland and the north of Scotland, start knocking out some of the critical sites there. So part of the Faslane escapade, they had a big fence around it, but in my opinion, it wasn't good enough. So we had the debrief at which the Admiral was there and various other RAF and Navy people. And I said, look, I gave a brief because we dressed up in Fantasian uniforms, because you're always the Fantasians in the army when you're fighting against. I mean, one chap, he had a big bushy moustache and said, well, you're the general, you're our general. And we had a good laugh doing it. But I said, there's 2 points. I said, here's the first point. The first point is, the Admiral sort of paying attention, and he's some other, I suppose, commander who was in charge of defending the base. I said, here's the first point, the most important point. The only reason the Royal Marines are with you on this base is they have the explicit job from the Defence Council of guarding nuclear weapons. So they are in charge of defending the base. And the Royal Marines Major perked up immediately at that. I said, I do this with the RAF. I said, the Royal Air Force Regiment, their job is to protect the base, not wing commander admin, Oh, well, I'm senior to him, so I'm in charge, and and the group captain speaks to him and says, you don't know what you're talking about. He's the guy in charge. I said, the second point is, you need big towers, because we were able to get up to within 50 metres of the fence, and at that stage, it's too late for you to stop us from coming through and causing a lot of trouble. Whereas if you stick big towers up, you'll see for miles. So when I came back here to live a few years ago, huge big towers, and I even met one of the local builders, and he said, oh, I was just an apprentice then. I remember it. That was a big fuss that went on. We were getting lifted up in big cranes, and helicopters were coming in with these cabins to put on top of the towers. So that's the whole point. These things actually have a benefit. It's not just soldiers and military people running around circles having a good laugh and, eating compo rations, etc. Things come out of it. But I go back to Berlin. We were in a place called Montgomery Barracks, it's in Gatow, which is almost in Potsdam. So it was about 10 miles away from Potsdam, where they had the Potsdam Conference, end of the war. Our barracks was a Luftwaffe barracks, and we still had the officers' mess was 100% there. It was one of those sort of Bavarian-looking buildings. And the Berlin Wall was 20 yards away. So it ran all the way down the camp and then ran through the bottom end of the camp. But it didn't go through there. It just that we couldn't occupy it. But we put the battalion pigs into there and, take them down and feed them. So there we were, right on there. So within the barracks, I can only speak for the officers' mess, and there were regular occasions when there were officers with a few beers in their hand would stand outside, go to the wall and shout abuse at these East German guys up in their turrets. Could have provoked international mayhem, but it didn't. However, on 3 separate occasions in 6 weeks, this is complete lunacy. I was the orderly, I was the orderly captain. So the doorbell rang and batter, middle of the night, had to go down. Orderly sergeant said, we need you up at the top. One of the lads, one of the Toms, has climbed over the fence. So that happened 3 times. So I then had to go up, find out what was happening, then go all the way down to not the Bridge of Spies, but quite next to that, where the East Germans would produce this guy, chastened soldier, etc. And then we'd have to talk and have to insist that the Russian, no, we'll not talk to you, we only talk to the Russians, etc. And then we'd get the guy back. So the commanding officer was throwing wobblers about this, and he was taking it out on me. I said, that's nothing to do with me. I just happened to be unfortunately on duty when these things happen. When it happened the 3rd time, I thought, right, I'll run in and try and calm down the CO before I go down to get this bloke. And ran in, and the adjutant said, the Colonel's not here. And he was laughing. And the Chief Clerk was there, and he was laughing as well. I said, right, what's the joke? Is this about me? He said, no. He said, the Colonel has been summoned by the General of British sector Berlin, who at that time was a chap called Redgrave, who had a sister whom you may have heard of. so very theatrical guy. Anyway, the story then came out in the CO's driver. Whenever you come in on discipline in the army, you have to take your headdress off and your belt off. I don't know what the reasons are. There'll be some, traditional reason for it. And then you go in at double time with the sort of sergeant or the sergeant major going, right, halt, boom. And that happened to the colonel. And we couldn't stop laughing, And I got a real bollocking from the general, and he was really annoyed about it. But we didn't have any more after that. But the main thing I did in Berlin, and this is what introduced me to the realities of the Cold War, as the signals officer, I had, despite my saying I'm not interested in technical things, I'm actually brainy enough to remember things, so I don't forget them. And I knew a lot about communications. And each week I had 3 days I would go in a vehicle, military vehicle, sometimes a Land Rover, sometimes a Vauxhall Viva, with military plates on it. And we'd drive up and down various areas in East Berlin because we were there to look on behalf of the BRICS, the British mission to the sort of Berlin Directorate, British, Russians, French and Americans, blah, blah. And BRICS were our spy division. And I'd look, first thing we'd do is I would look at all the antennae that were strung out, something big, long, not 100 yards, but maybe 30, 40 yards antenna strung out of a building to somewhere else. And they all tell me something. I tell them the first thing, you look at the length of it, you calculate the length, calculate the direction, you have a compass anyway, just to make sure. And then you make a mental note of it. Don't ever take notes. Or any notes you take mustn't be direct ones. True spy stuff, And then when we get back, we go down to Berlin headquarters and go into there with the spy team, They're just British guys, lance corporals from the intelligence corps. And we work out the type of radios that these were connected to. Therefore, we knew the type of units, who were there. And on one very famous day, world famous day, the North Vietnamese marched into Saigon at the very end of April 1975. The 1st of May, so it's maybe 2 days later, the big communist parade in East Berlin. And I thought, well, I'll go along to this anyway because it'll be very interesting. And took my photographer from the int section, forget his name, he was a sergeant, very good photographer. And anyway, he sat there with his big camera because we're in this stand, we're allowed to take photographs, we're officially accredited and allowed to do it. One of his photographs was down the barrel of a gun, a tank gun. So the tanks would come round and they would salute by turning their barrels up. We actually got the correct angle. The shot he got was blown up when we got it back. It was a different kind of radio. They then knew that these radios were only issued to whatever was the guards regiments, the tank regiments or whatever, and therefore there was the new guards tank regiment in. But more importantly, we knew these radios were actually deployed. So that was a very important thing. That gave me a little inkling of how important observing was. But one of the very interesting points about being in Berlin, one of our officers was an exchange officer. He was from the United States. And we would have officers over there. My son was eventually an exchange officer with the United States, US Airborne. And he spent, I think it was something like 19 months in Iraq with them, having been there 2 or 3 times previously and wounded in the process. But anyway, this American officer, he was a Green Beret and he was a big guy, a nice guy and quiet and all that. he said, well, he said, I'm quite interested in this spy stuff, you know. He said, it's very interesting. He said, I've actually, the American embassy has asked me to do a wee bit of looking about. So he told me one or two of the things he was doing, but it was the type of stuff that we were doing anyway. You would go to the Europe Hotel, I think it's called, and every single person you saw was a spy. I'm not making this up. So you knew all the spies, but I'm seeing you people and whatever. However, this chap persisted in this behaviour. He was a, you know, I said, Green Beret, special forces guy from Vietnam, etc. Years later, my son, he said, I've sent you a video from a guy who was giving a talk at Sandhurst. You might know him. He's got a Parachute Regiment tie on, and he's an American, and he served with the regiment in the sort of 74, 75 time. So I played this video from Sandhurst, you know, talking to the cadets and everybody. And this guy said, yes, well, I hope all you crap hats out there have taken notice of my Parachute Regiment tie. And they all burst out laughing and said, yeah, said, I served with Parachute Regiment 2 years. Sort of 74, 75, you know. So I looked at him. Then eventually, you know, I phoned up Sandhurst the next day, said, I've got to find this guy. Got in touch with him. Yes, it was my pal from, you know. Now that's going on for don't make too much on 50 years previously. It was Doug. Wow. And he's worked with me. I hope you've read the book. He's Douglas H. Wise, the guy who was Director of Operations for the CIA and Deputy Director with Defence Intelligence Agency. But we started off knowing each other when we were in Berlin and both involved in what we at the time regarded as that. Well, we'll do it. You know, it sounds like a good laugh. We'll go and find these things out and we'll come back and write them down. But Berlin was also a bit chilling because folk were killed on the Berlin Wall when we were there. You know, it was the terrible one, but I was quite close to it at the time. I was down at the Reichstag, and we had a young Turkish boy fell in the water. So that was about 200 yards away. So it was a commotion. So I went along. The East Germans had fired on his family when they were trying to save him, and the wee boy got drowned, you know. So that was how rigorous. But then there's a funny side of it. Because I was a captain, I had great educational opportunities. First of all, I had to take a tour bus, a British military tour bus filled up with people and diplomats every Saturday. So I had to take that because I was a captain. I don't know how a lieutenant couldn't have done it, but I was a captain, so we had to do it. And the majors, they would run away and hide. So I think I got it by default. So I would go all around East Berlin and Berlin, so I knew it inside out. But the better one was I also had to take the military train 3 days a week, the British military train. Now, I think Michael Portillo or Bill Nye was on it recently in some programme, and it's still the exact same, you know, the wooden carriages and the velvet seats. I probably have the same menu because I only had two choices. So I would do that, but we go through East Germany. When it pulled out of the main station in Berlin, and then it would stop at the border in Berlin, and then it would change to an East German driver. We'd chug on, and we'd get to Marienborn, where I would get out with the Sergeant Major, who was from Brixmis. So he's a fully fluent Russian speaker, and he works for the spy organisation. And my job was to hand over all the travel documents, all the passports, ID cards, and then they would take them away and then they'd bring them back. But what I didn't know was the antics that the soldiers got up to, because we'd have a guard on the train of about 8 guys. So one day, standing on the platform with this Russian officer, and the Sergeant Major just looked at me and said, "Look right, but don't do it fast." So I just glanced to the right. The Russian soldiers are standing there pointing to the badges on their hats, you know, those sort of wrap-round hats they have, you know, or even, the big Astrakhan hats with a badge on it. And then a minute or two later, something would come whistling across from the train, and they would throw the hat across, and then they'd march back into the other room. Our guys were throwing them copies of Penthouse magazine out the window, and these guys were throwing through belt buckles, hats, Astrakhan hats. And I thought, surely they must know what's happening. But the Russians never made any mention of it. It was all very formal. But you can't do these things forever. And eventually I came out and went to what nowadays would be known as a reserve battalion. I went to the TA as the adjutant of 4 Para, which is now commanded by my son, near enough 50 years later. He's not that old. He's not ancient. It's only his dad that's ancient.
With the flag patrols you were doing in East Berlin, did you ever get stopped by the Soviets or interfered with? Sorry, you're going to have to come back next week for the next instalment of David Mackay's military adventures in the Parachute Regiment. The episode extras such as videos, photos and other content are available via a link in the episode information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous efforts of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening, and look forward to seeing you next week.